Greetings, everyone, and welcome to UC Berkeley Osher Lifelong Learning Institute Speaker Series. Today, we have two campus colleagues, and both of them Mark Twain scholars, returning to OLLI at Berkeley for this timely exchange on Mark Twain that they've entitled Mark Twain Revealed, a conversation on Twain's autobiography and other revelations. Linda Haverty Rugg is an Associate Vice Chancellor for Research and professor in the Scandinavian Department at UC Berkeley. As a graduate student in Comp Lit, she wrote a chapter of her dissertation on Mark Twain's autobiography, completing the research for the chapter in the Mark Twain Papers here at UC Berkeley. Subsequently, she published on Mark Twain's use of photographs of himself in creating a public image and Mark Twain's response to anti-Semitism when he lived in Austria. Since 1980, Bob Hirst has been the general editor of the Mark Twain Project and curator of the Mark Twain Papers in the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. Before welcoming both of them, I'd like simply to say that today's conversation is going to be taped and available sometime next week after it's been captioned. We're hoping that if you have any questions, that you will put those questions in the chat room. We may run the full time with the two of these esteemed colleagues being in conversation and presenting. And so we will follow up with your chat questions sometime within the week. So thank you both for joining us. I give the floor to Linda.
Okay. Hello, everybody. We're really happy to be here today to talk about one of our favorite topics. And I feel a little bit abashed of being called a Twain scholar alongside Bob, because Bob has been a Twain scholar for a very long time, and I'm very much a neophyte in comparison. But we have already done some practice conversations, and we've really enjoyed our time together. And so we're looking forward to this conversation today. So basically what we've compiled a group of slides, and we're going to use those as touch points for our conversation, in which we'll talk about different ways in which Mark Twain reveals himself or doesn't reveal himself, as the case may be. And so let's see, I'm trying to advance my slides here. This first photograph is an iconic one. I think most people who are familiar with Mark Twain's image, which is probably every single person who's in this presentation, will recognize him. Is there something special you want to say about this particular image?
I mean, this was by a photographer named A.F. Bradley. He's a very successful social photographer in New York. We know exactly when this photograph was taken. It was 15 March 1907. Clemens is 71. He's been persuaded to have these photographs taken because a friend of his out in San Francisco has lost her house, and they're trying to raise money to help her out. And he's sworn he won't ever be photographed again, but he agrees to go down and sit for Bradley. And Bradley has created a turntable where he basically sits Clemens in the chair and then turns the turntable, so Sam doesn't have to do anything extraordinary. He doesn't have to, he doesn't have to pose. He just has to sit there. And you saw some of the other, I think there's something like 14 or 15 negatives taken at this time. And because they are then signed and sent out to San Francisco and sold, this becomes actually the most common view of Mark Twain ever. Still the most common view. If you just ask for photographs on the net, you will see Bradley all over the place. He thought 4 of them were the best he'd seen of himself. He's very critical of what he sees. I like it because it reminds me of what Bret Hart said remembers feeling when he first met him in San Francisco back in 1865. He said he had an aquiline nose and an aquiline eye, an eagle eye, so eagle-like that a second lid would not have surprised me. I think that gets to the heart of what's good about this. But as you say, this is curated. This is it's anything but candid.
It's not candid. No, it's posed. It's a beautiful photograph of him. And it's great that this is the last photograph of him, because this photograph is actually, it's a daguerreotype. And this is the first image that we have of him. This is taken, he's 15, right?
He's 15, almost exactly. There's a date on it, which is 29 November, 1850. He's going to be 15 the next day.
Yeah. So it's 1850. Yeah, 1850. And he's just become a printer's, they called it a printer's double, didn't they?
The printer's double is the lower one. That's what you start out as.
Okay, so
he's just become a jewel printer.
Oh, okay.
Okay, he's basically graduated from his apprenticeship.
Okay. And this is his
and within weeks, he's going to join his brother, Orion, who has bought the Hannibal Western Union, a newspaper. And Mark Twain, the first piece we know that Mark Twain published, not as Mark Twain, but Sam Clemens, occurs in January 1851.
Okay.
It's called A Gallant Fireman. It's about Jim Wolfe evacuating the burning house when a fire started next door. And, I mean, the brilliance is there right from the beginning.
His first piece. I became fascinated with this. I was in the Mark Twain Papers. I was writing my dissertation. And I realized that when this image was made, he had to perform a kind of a trick to get his name. You see, he's holding his name, Sam, in his hand. He had to perform a kind of a trick in order to get that name to come out correctly in the image. Can you explain what kind of thing this was?
We should say that this is, I think it's like a graduation present, almost. So that's why the focus is on his typesetting. And what you'll see this is reproduced all over the place on the net, but it's all from the single daguerreotype in the papers. And so there's no other original anywhere else. And most of those will say, oh, he's holding, the Sam is on his belt buckle. No, he's holding what's called a printer's stick. A printer holds the stick and puts pieces of type into it as he's setting type. Sets the liner type, fills it up, and pulls it over to the galley. So in order to get it to come out, as Linda says, he has to set it exactly the way a typesetter would set it, upside down and backwards. Because the daguerreotype doesn't use a negative, it's going to reverse the image. And he knows all that. It's the trick that he is having fun performing. And I could say for sure, this is really Sam. I get people coming to me all the time with someone with a mustache or something. Is this Mark Twain? Usually not. But this one we know for sure, not only because it came from his daughter. She owned it and gave it to Dixon Wechter and to UC back in 1949. But also, not too long ago, I came across a letter to his sister-in-law, who had just lost her husband, Orion. And he says in the beginning of this letter, oh, the boy picture, I remember it well. In other words, he remembers exactly what this is all about. He said, of course, just to make things complicated, I destroyed it in 1860. If he destroyed it, there were two. That's all we can say.
Yeah.
But there's no question that he remembers it, and that is him. It is, however, him reversed. To see him the way he is in, quote, real life, you'd have to reverse it.
And that was the thing that fascinated me, was the fact that he was conversant with the technology, both printing technology and photographic technology at the time, so that he understood how they worked together, so he could produce an image that was correct. But this is one of the many, many treasures that you hold in the Mark Twain Papers. And when I first, came into the papers, this was back in it was in the 1980s. You were relatively new.
I was
in your
brand new.
position.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
And I came in, and the papers at that time were like a row of filing cabinets in a dingy hallway. You could sort of barely squeeze by, and little offices in which people had stacks of paper and boxes, and they were working away. But what I was going to ask you about, this is another image that we were going to look at, just showing people how this was made, and also that this is one of the early things that was probably set into type by him.
Yes,
right?
I think there's really no question that he must have set that in type. And one of the interesting things about it to me is that it has been in the papers since they were created by Mark Twain back in 1906. And they certainly was in the papers after his mother died. This was in his mother's Bible, which we used all the time for the genealogical information in the back. But no one had ever looked through the Bible. It's one of these great big, thick, enormous Bibles. I just happened to have nothing to do one day. So I just started leafing through it. And, it turns out, of course, Jane uses it like a filing cabinet. And I would say that this is part of the same impulse to memorialize his graduation from his apprenticeship as a typesetter. This almost certainly was an apprentice task. If you're going to be a typesetter for a newspaper, you need to be able to set ads. And you can see that you have to learn how to do a square. You can see that if you look at it closely, it's made out of other characters. It's nothing very fancy about it. And just by virtue of the fact that it says San Clemens, Hannibal, Missouri, we know it had to have been done before 1850. So
it was part of his practice. Yeah. And it's the fact that you found this in the Bible as just like a random piece of paper is sort of emblematic of how things were in the Twain Papers. Like I would be looking through a file, and a laundry list would fall out, of the typescript and so on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the papers because they're such a treasure. And because this has been, a big part of your life's work. And so on this slide, we have just sort of a sampling of what kinds of things you would find in the papers. Maybe you could say a little bit of something about what kinds of things there are.
Well, I put little tags on it so you can read the tags if your screen is big enough. But basically, 10,000 letters, 750 literary manuscripts, Huck Finn working notes, sample of his hair, notebooks that he designed himself, marginalia. That's Theodore Roosevelt. He's crossed out the title and said banalities instead. Checks, proofs.
A light bill, looks like the electric bill. Yeah.
Just an enormous amount of stuff, documentation, which he put together and put in the hands of his biographer. It was by no means everything, let me say that. It may seem like everything even to me sometimes, but it's not everything. Much of the really important stuff was still held by his daughter. And that has only gradually emerged into the world, and some of it has come to us, and some of it hasn't.
Some of it's still out there.
Yeah.
So if you ever encounter any old libraries,
absolutely.
And you run across something that looks like it belongs in the Twain Papers, you should get in touch with. Definitely get in touch with the Twain Papers. If you find
an old book that says, in the front says S.L. Clemens, buy it. It'll be worth more when you walk out of the bookstore than when you pay for it. You won't find any books with a book plate. He always just signed his name.
One of the things that I wondered about was, how did these papers end up in Berkeley? Because, Clemens was born in Missouri. He came out to the West Coast. Then he ended up on the East Coast. He was married to an Easterner. kind of became an Easterner himself in a way, went over to Europe. He doesn't have any connection to Berkeley. So how did it happen that these papers ended up in Berkeley?
Well, you're right. I mean, the longest connection, really, as far as residence goes, is in Hartford. He spent 20 years in Hartford.
Yeah.
His daughter was his only survivor, Clara. And his will specified that basically that she couldn't dispose of the papers in any way except through her own will. So she had to die in order for them to change ownership. So they were, by virtue of that, they were sort of migrating around. They were first in Paine's hands, and then a man named Bernard Devoto, you may have heard of, or is, who had criticized Paine for not letting him see the papers. He was appointed as Paine's successor. He did not have a professorship at Harvard, but Harvard let him bring the papers to the Widener.
To the Widener Library.
And so he gets 2 big rooms in Widener, as you know, is not something that happens to any professor there. That was obviously a lure. And Devoto keeps them there and does a lot of organizing, but he quarrels with Clara about what he can publish. And so
they don't really get along with each other.
He's a very prickly guy.
Yeah.
And very, he has very strong opinions about it. And he discovered something that he wanted to publish, which is called Letters from the Earth. And Clara said no, she wouldn't allow that to be published. It showed her father's disrespect for the Bible, which it certainly did. And in any case, so even when they're at Harvard, they're still owned by Clara. Okay, so that
Harvard has control.
She has control, but Harvard has no say over it. They have no hold over it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, as far as Paine is concerned, just to say a couple words about him, he was an intimate of Sam Clemens. He came in, he wanted to write his biography, right? And so he actually would sit in Clemens' bedroom, take pictures of Clemens, take notes, and
I was in residence with him, basically.
Yeah.
Paine did an enormous amount of work. He had written the biography of Thomas Nast, which Mark Twain knew about. He actually okayed some of his own letters to be published in the Nast biography. And he picked Paine as his official biographer in 1906. And Paine was given access to everything that was, with Clemens. He was given, let's say, carte blanche. He could go to anybody who knew Clemens and ask for their letters, and he would take them and have them typed and usually return them, not always. And he did all kinds. He went out, out west and visited all kinds of friends that Clemens had. He did an enormous amount of work. But he was fundamentally a Victorian biographer who believed that one of his roles was to protect the subject from saying anything he shouldn't have said. And so, in addition to being a source of a lot of information that only he knew, he published a very big biography, which is still very useful to us because it has that privileged access behind it. But it is also full of suppressions, as we now know. In any case, he published a relatively little of the papers. He knew about them, he had a long list of them in the biography, but in general, he did not publish a great deal. And so, for instance, for the autobiography, he only published 2 volumes of what he thought would be at least a 6-volume work. That's partly a commercial question. These books needed to make money. They weren't university press books, that's for sure. In any case, so he dies in 1937, and they appoint Devoto to be the next thing. Devoto quarrels, as I say, with Clara, and resigns 15 or 16 times, and eventually does resign in favor of a guy named Dixon Wechter.
Dixon Wechter is there.
Who's an American historian. He's at UCLA. He's also has an appointment at the Huntington. He's the head of research at the Huntington.
Library.
And in fact, actually, while he's down there, he publishes a couple of books of Mark Twain's letters, Mark Twain's correspondence with a woman named Mary Mason Fairbanks, which the Huntington owned. And he has enough access to Clara. He's really good at dealing with Clara.
Yeah.
You can't quite see, he's a big, tall Texan.
And she likes him.
And she likes him. He's a very courtly guy,
Yeah.
and he knows how to deal with her, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that interests me is this sort of genealogy of people who have dealt with the papers, who've been responsible for the papers, and how their particular take on Clemens and also their particular style as people had control over what happened. So you have Payne, who is a New Englander, who is a Victorian, as you said, who is worried about Twain appearing too explosive or too heretical or too whatever, and he wants to sort of, make the image nice. And then you have DeVoe, who's the opposite, actually, who's kind of a firebrand himself and loves the firebrand part of Twain and wants to get that out there against Clara's wishes, because Clara is a little bit more on the Albert Bigelow Payne side. And then you have Dixon Wechter, who is the Texan, who knows how to court this woman, Twain's daughter, and is a scholar.
And his first ambition is to do a biography of Mark Twain that using exclusive access to these papers, which of course makes a lot of sense. But that means, among other things, he doesn't let anybody else see them, which is also the way DeVoe operated. Even though they were themselves excluded, when they get access, they don't turn around and let other people see it. And for reasons that we don't really know, Wechter decided that he wanted to come to Berkeley. I'm trying to get around to answer your question.
Yeah, we're slowly, you notice our style here is very Clemens-like. We're slowly getting around to the point that I asked about the question before. It's like, how did it end up at Berkeley? And the answer to it has to do with Dixon Wechter.
Wechter. So he's welcome to the history department up here, and he asks Clara, can he take the papers with him to Berkeley? And she says, well, you can have them for 10 years. And then literally before the papers arrive in the library here, he writes her and says, I really think you should change your will so that instead of giving the papers to Yale, which is what she intended to do, I think we should give them to UC. And she writes back and says, I'll send you a codicil next week. Done, like that.
Clearly he was very charming.
Now, of course, Yale was not too happy about that. Now, they had been expecting the papers. Yale had pleased the family by giving Mark Twain an honorary degree in 1888, quite early. The family, of course, was not quite sure that Mark Twain was a serious literary person. And so an honorary degree was an important thing for them. And that's partly why they were aiming at Yale. It made a lot of sense. They had spent a lot of time in Connecticut, so it made sense to go to Yale. But Wechter very easily persuaded Clara to change her will, and she did. She made one concession to Yale. There was one complete published book manuscript in the papers, Joan of Arc, which Mark Twain said is best work. Most literary critics
would say no.
Would not agree with that.
No.
I always say it's Buck and Tom following Joan around France. But she decides to pull that out and give it to Yale. So it's at Yale. Everything else is here. And of course, that also describes indirectly what the papers were like. They are principally the things that were not published. Anything that's published goes out into the world, either stays out in the world with the publisher or with a magazine or whatever. The things that are not published stay in his possession.
Yeah. And so the mission of the papers was in part to publish the works that had not, publish the things that had not yet been
That is correct,
published,
yeah.
to make sure that the editions that were out there were the correct editions according to what you have in the papers.
Well, the initial sort of feeling about the papers, well, maybe it contains another Huckleberry Finn, you know. I mean, the notion was that this was to be mined for
New work.
For new work, right?
Yeah.
Now, Devoto was pretty skeptical about that, and his view was relatively few of these things should be published, but he wanted to publish a lot of them. He published some of the autobiography, as you know. But the mission of the archive changed beginning in 1965, when the National Endowment for the Humanities was created and decided to sponsor critical editions of 10 19th century American writers, all of them male. But the idea behind that was we need to keep all of these PhDs in American literature busy so they don't fill the shelves of the library with histories of the American novels. So we're going to give them these editions to work on, which are really kind of mindless things to do. And that'll get those texts out there. They'll be perfect texts. Then the really important people can criticize those texts. So that changed the focus to, at least in part, getting everything into the papers that we didn't already have. Copies of things, by and large.
Right.
I mean, we still do buy things. They're very expensive, but we do buy occasionally.
Yeah.
But since 1967, we have systematically acquired copies of stuff that's elsewhere. So that the archive is, even before the electronic revolution, it was a virtual archive. That's to say, it didn't have just originals. It had copies of all the letters, copies of all the literary manuscripts that were out there. Anything that we could get copied, we got copied.
Yeah, and as a scholar, I really understand the point of that, because what happens then is that this becomes a repository, so that if you're somebody who wants to study Mark Twain seriously, you would come to the papers and you would have all of these things at your disposal, whether it was the originals or copies. And the other thing you would have was people. I mean, what you see on this slide is the sort of the genealogy of the people who were the chief editors, managing editors. So Dixon Wechter is followed by Henry Nash Smith, is followed by Frederick Anderson, is followed by this guy named Hirst. But alongside you in the papers is a little team of editors. And many of these people have been working in the papers almost as long as you have.
Yes.
And so when you come in as a scholar and you say, okay, I have a project, I'm working on X, these people know pretty much everything there is to know about this, and they can put their hands on, okay, they say, was there ever any image taken of Mark Twain with Bret Hart? They know where Mark Twain was having dinner on September 10th, 1867. No, I mean, it's like you have a little flotilla of experts and all of these resources there that range from manuscripts to photographs to other kinds of artifacts. So it is this gold mine of resources for anybody who is interested in doing research.
Right.
And that's one of the main functions you guys have, I guess.
That is
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the unintended consequences of the NEH funding was that it was used to hire graduate students. I mean, I think I've told you, I got this job in 1967 because I failed my German. I lost my TA-ship and I needed to find a job, and they advertised for checkers and proofreaders, so I applied. But when I came back in 1980, I mean, I was still working with 2 or 3 people who had been there, back in 1960s. So once they were given access, Fred's real virtue was that he knew how to delegate. So he basically tossed the responsibility for either helping scholars get their editions done or just to do the editions ourselves. He tossed it to us.
Mhm.
And we taught ourselves textual edit.
Had to be
You couldn't learn that in the English department. They weren't teaching. But you were thrown into this situation where you simply had to figure out what to do.
Mhm.
I'm not saying we always got the right answer. We certainly did not. But we were basically thrown into the midst of this enormous archive. And very quickly, we knew more about it than the professors who were supposed to be doing the editions, who could only come for a couple of months in the summer.
Yeah.
I mean, understandably, when we knew more about it, we were being paid $2.18 an hour to I don't know, to us, it was a minuscule wage.
Yeah.
And we had absolutely free run of the place. We didn't have to kind of ask anybody permission. We could do whatever we wanted to. As long as we weren't, putting strawberry jam on them, we had to be careful about some things. But that was a very big change that nobody quite saw coming.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the big projects that you undertook, and this is sort of the next thing we wanted to get to, was the autobiography. And the autobiography, a number of people really felt like it was not possible to create an edition of Mark Twain's autobiography. There'd been an attempt made by Payne, whom we saw earlier, that, as you said, it was really only 2 volumes of something he thought should be 6. And part of that was that there was a kind of a lack of organization, and it also was, there was just so much of it. But I started working on autobiography. My dissertation was called Failing at Autobiography. So that was the title of my dissertation. And one of the authors that I was working on who had failed, at his autobiography was Mark Twain. And the reason that I thought that he had failed was because I had seen these published editions. There was Payne's edition, Bernard Devoto, who you saw really had published parts of the autobiography according to his own method. Like Devoto came up with a method where he was going to create thematic organization. Payne had done chronological organization, but it was clear that there were a lot of holes and things missing. And then finally, this guy named Charles Nider had decided that he was going to take what Twain had left behind and try to impose chronological order on it. And the reason that I was interested in Twain's autobiography is that I didn't truly think that he had failed.
Mm-hmm.
What I felt was that in the modern period, what you could see is that authors were no longer satisfied with the traditional form that autobiography would take. And Twain says something like where they take you from the cradle and drive you along to the grave. The authors no longer felt comfortable trying to represent their lives using this traditional form. And you could really see this in Mark Twain's work, where he had tried. And he tried to find a different method. And he started dictating instead of writing. And he says, I found the method. This is the right way to do it. And he writes to Howells, I think I've hit upon it. This is the way to do it. And he would start his day just dictating whatever came into his head about his life. It didn't have to be from his childhood. It could be from any time. And then he would just continue to tell stories going off of that beginning, the way it occurred to him. And his stenographer, he had a stenographer sitting there who would write it down. So he had an audience. This is Twain performing, which is a mode that he was very good at and very familiar with. He loved to perform. So he spoke. It was his voice, and he was dictating. He was just letting his mind wander. And so what happened was you had these dictations that didn't have any clear form that you could follow. And so the people who were trying to do the editions were flummoxed,
Well,
or, yeah.
I mean, they concluded that no addition could be done. I mean, well, this is if you were in the 60s trying to make sense of this autobiography, you had these three very imperfect and incomplete versions of it, printed, published. And then you had all of these original documents, which were not terribly well organized or understood. I mean, you can't organize them unless you understand them. So one of the big breakthroughs for us, because we were just as puzzled by this as others who had succeeded over the years. And we postponed working on the autobiography until 2010 loomed. 2010 was an important date because that was 100 years after his death. And UC Press made it quite clear to me that if I didn't make that deadline, they were not going to be very happy with me. So it was pretty clear that 2010 was, something we should be shooting at. But we really didn't understand this until we got into it and started working the way editors do with the actual documents. And this is the beginning of one of the breakthroughs. Mark Twain, if you back up, you saw the title page this is the title page.
Yeah.
Okay. As you see, his name numbered at 1, and this is number 2, and then an early attempt followed by. Here insert the 44 old typewritten pages. Well, we'd be happy to do that if we just knew what they were.
Yeah.
And the fact is that Paine didn't know what they were. And so that's him. Mark Twain has written 45. That's the page that's going to follow these 44 pages. Paine crosses it out and writes page 9.
9, because he
Because
didn't
know what it was, and he didn't know where to put it. So I can brag about this because I didn't do any of this. All my editors were responsible for this. Harriet Smith, Ben Griffin, and Lynn Salamo are the ones who figured this all out. And it'd be too tedious to explain to you exactly how. But basically, the thing he's referring to here was a typescript of my autobiography, random extracts from it, which was typed in Vienna. It itself was lost. I mean, you couldn't find it. It was gone. But because it had been inserted into these typescripts he was generating, 2 copies of it existed, and we also had the manuscript for it. And it turns out, of course, that the missing typescript that needed to belong in the sequence we were trying to reconstruct was filed with this, naturally. We're jumping ahead a little bit here, but basically the real second mystery was, you were going to do that.
Yeah, here we go. Was
the fact that in these daily dictations, as these were folders that had a dictation in it, it was identified only by the date it was done. Some of these folders, many of these folders in the beginning had 3 or 4 separate typescripts, not carbons, separate typescripts of essentially the same dictation.
There we have another example here, yeah.
That's just one example.
Right, you basically have the same text repeated in different typescripts with different pagination. So
Really
here
wildly
you see
different.
wildly different. So this is the same text. This one is page 4 and this one is page 1015. And so the task was to try to figure out, like, what order were these typescripts meant to appear in, right?
And which of them is the actual
Which is right, because there's some cross
the
outs.
one that's final, right?
Right, yeah.
Well, this is a case where curators in the past, we don't know who their names are, did something perfectly logical. They found 4 typescripts all with the same date, they put them in the same folder. But we eventually figured out that when he started out doing this dictation, he didn't generate a carbon. He didn't generate a carbon with each typescript. But he gotten fairly far and he realized he needed a second copy in order to show which howls, in order to, so he has it retyped. I mean, who knew, right? It's cheap to have it retyped. He has it retyped and uses it to go on to the next step. And then at a certain point, he gets persuaded to publish selections from it in the North American Review. And that's why the third typescript was generated. That has much lower page numbers. Anyways, all of this starts to fall into place once you reconstruct these typescripts using the pagination.
Yeah.
The pagination had been made, if we had seen it in his study, there would have been three piles of pages, and it would have been quite obvious what was going on, but it took Lynn Salomo and Harriet and Ben quite a while to figure out what had been clear in the past, but not now. Once that was settled, it was clear what Mark Twain wanted in the autobiography and what he didn't want, because he'd saved all these earlier attempts as well, the ones that you encountered as, in various states of disarray. He experiments for 30 years. He has a very clear idea quite early on about what he wants to do. He doesn't want to limit himself to length. He wants to tell the exact truth. He doesn't want Louis to edit it.
Yeah, he doesn't want his wife to touch it.
He says all those things, and it's quite clear, but it takes him a while to get to the point where he actually can succeed in doing this. Goes through various, wrinkles, including deciding, well, I'm not going to do it at all. I'm going to do this instead. I mean, it took him a long while.
Yeah, and I mean, some of the writing that he discarded or the early attempts is really beautiful, right?
Yes.
It's really fascinating because it's about his childhood and so on. And some of it was published, like Payne published it, even though it wasn't meant to be published.
Just by accident, I think, because Payne didn't fully understand what he was looking at. We didn't either, obviously. But Payne didn't understand what he was looking at. So he publishes 2 volumes, but they are almost entirely of the things that Mark Twain rejected. They are early things that he would not have included in his autobiography.
Yeah.
I mean, Payne didn't know that.
Payne, yeah. So the autobiography was something of a mystery. I mean, when I came into the archives in the 80s, I encountered these typescripts that were just multiplied. It just looked like something gone wild, as sort of a chaos. This slide just tells you that he had the idea that he wanted to keep some of the things that he was writing from being published because they were too potentially inflammatory or could inflict pain, as he says. And so that was part of the issue too. I think the 2010 deadline, in fact, referred to the idea that he wanted it to come out he didn't want it to come out until 100 years after his death, right? And this is just a schematic diagram that you made that shows what the normal progression is for a manuscript. It goes to typescript, printer's proof, and publication, but
This is
an attempt to do the schematic representation of what happened with the typescripts.
Here's the first type. We call it TS1 because it is the first one. It's what the stenographer generates from her notes.
Yeah.
Then she types the second one. I mean, it's not a carbon. She retypes this, right, to make TS2. And at a later stage, someone, we're not sure who, retypes it, makes TS4. It's a kind of a last copy that has no markings on it. It's kind of a preservation copy. And then this is the copy that we call 3. It was designed to feed the North American Review selections. That's why it has to be chained. He edits it down so that it's not.
You can see the editing.
Yeah, and you can see but if you're just looking at these in a folder, you can't tell which of them you should be reading or quoting.
Yeah, right? And this is the whole idea of what is the real thing. What is the genuine article? And in the archival world, trying to figure out what the intention was is something that you guys worked with very hard. And so I was talking about it as a failed autobiography. You guys actually produced it. And I'm just wondering about your take on it. Is this a failed or a successful work? And this is
I don't think there's any question that it's experimental. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't know. He doesn't know what he's doing exactly. He's simply feeling his way. He knows what he's not capable of doing.
Yeah.
He's not capable of sitting down and telling you, I was born on 30 November 1830 and, you know, marching toward the grave. He's just not going to do that. He doesn't have the self-discipline to do it. He doesn't have the disposition to do it.
And he doesn't think it's interesting. He says,
That's right.
he goes, it's the side excursions that are interesting.
That's
And that's what we should talk about, are the side excursions. This trip from the cradle to the grave, that's not interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's not mysterious to me that you thought it was failed because you weren't able to look at
I couldn't
anything
figure it out.
closely, even remotely like what he had created and wanted published eventually.
Yeah.
So I think it's clearly experimental. Just judging by the reaction to volume 1, I would say that there is a degree of success. I mean, that this is not something that we have a lot of criteria to measure it against. It's new. It's not really easy to say, does it succeed or not? My own personal feeling is that it is quite amazing to be able to sit there and listen to Mark Twain talk about whatever he feels like talking about it for weeks on end. I mean, he's a great talker.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things we noticed about these typescripts is the ones that are from the initial, you know, transcription are almost never revised.
He just talks.
He gets it right
Yeah.
the way he wants it, you know, in speaking it. So we put in a few slides here about what happened to volume 1. Volume 1 of the autobiography had to begin with all these experiments and only could include about, I think, a month and a half, 2.5 months of the dictations. So it's by no means a even sample of the final form. We try to explain all that. I have a feeling that most people don't read it. Well, in fact, the New York Times guy didn't read it.
Yeah, he says this is a book for dipping, not plunging, right? So you don't, it's not a book that you read from cover to cover.
Right.
It's a book that you can jump in almost anywhere.
Because you're not going to miss anything if you're not going to be discombobulated by not understanding the narrative, because there is no narrative, right?
Yeah.
But
Oops, I'm sorry, I went too fast.
I should have said that the New York Times, I think, we've been published since 1967. The New York Times never reviews our books, but they wrote an editorial about this one.
Yeah. And it was on the bestseller list. People bought it.
24 weeks.
And maybe some people in the audience actually bought the autobiography and read it. It would be interesting to know what people feel about it. But like we said, it's not a book for reading necessarily from cover to cover, but you definitely hear the voice because it was based on the voice. Most of it was based on the voice. And here's the Costco store.
Well, I'm just giving sort of visual evidence of what it felt like, because we've been publishing scholarly editions since 1967, and usually they sell a maximum of 2,000 copies in 10 years.
Yeah.
This one sold 500,000 copies in a little over a year.
Yeah.
Some of them were sold at Costco. Now, that doesn't prove that it's a success. It just proves that Mark Twain's autobiography was of interest to lots of people.
People wanted to know. I mean, this question has popped up about his voice and what his physical voice sounded like. There was actually a recording of his voice, but we don't have it. It's one of the things that's gotten lost, right?
Well, he recorded his voice in a number of cases. Like a book called American Claimant. He dictates a large part of it, but those cylinders have never been found. These are wax cylinders. There's an Edison recording machine. He doesn't go on with that because it's a machine. He needs an audience when he's talking. And that's why he winds up with this hobby and with 2 or 3 other stenographers down the line, because they do react to what he's saying. But the machine, of course, doesn't. But We've not found any of those recordings.
Yeah. So we haven't actually heard the physical voice, although it's been described. People describe it as a sort of, he has a sort of a higher register voice.
Right, and very slow.
And twangy, of course, because, yeah.
But extremely slow. People, I mean, he was so slow that Isabel Lyon, who didn't have shorthand, she could transcribe dictated letters.
What he was
fully,
saying.
you know, without any trouble.
Yeah, and so we wanted to talk also about one of the things that, there he said there was a recording of his voice on a Mark Twain CD-ROM. I don't know if I've heard that.
Well, there is a recording out there made by a protege of Clemens, is a guy named Gillette, who was an actor, who recorded himself reading The Jumping Frog as he remembered hearing Clemens record it. And so unless the labeling is accurate and careful, that's often thought to be Mark Twain himself, but it's not.
It's not.
If there is a real recording that he's found that I haven't seen, I'd like to know about it.
Okay.
I get asked about it every year.
So another piece of my research that I became very interested in was photography and autobiography. And Mark Twain is a sort of a shining example of someone who, he was very interested in technology generally.
Oh, boy.
You see that already in that daguerreotype of him as a print setter, and his interest in imagery, and he famously went bankrupt investing in an automatic type setting machine. But he was just fascinated with technology, and he was fascinated with what technology could do. And in the case of photographs, he was interested in how they both were able to represent something very precisely and also potentially represent something that was not true. And the way that photographs could lie, the way that photographs seem to tell you the truth and actually maybe don't, is one of the things that he loved very much about photography. And he actually wanted to include photographs in his autobiography. And so there was a series, and you were able to point out.
Well, this is the first. This is one of the TypeScript pages, and he says right down here, the pictures which Dr. Payne made on the portico here several weeks ago have been developed and are good. For the sake of the moral lesson which they teach, I wish to insert a set of them here, and it goes on. So there are a lot of hard decisions about the autobiography, but including these photographs was not a hard decision.
Because he says,
it was absolutely necessary.
Yeah, and I think that it's very interesting that the man he agreed to have Payne be his biographer, and it happened that Payne was also a photographer. And so this combination of biographer and photographer was something that Clemens was really interested in, because he was an author, probably one of the first to develop a very strong self-image, right?
Yes.
Images of him were already out there when he was alive, and he was recognizable, right?
Oh,
and people knew him from his image. Yeah. What is it? He said he was the most conspicuous?
Most conspicuous person on the planet. And he said that about when he starts to wear the white suit in 1906, just before this begins.
So these are the photographs that he meant to include. And this is, what interested me about these also was that they're a suite of photographs, and they're taken on the porch, as he says, on the portico in his house in New Hampshire. And they only shift very slightly from one image to the next. What he's interested in his pose, but he also wants to try to give the reader, the viewer, the impression that you are able to read his thoughts. So the captions that we see here are supposedly what he is thinking as these photographs are being taken. Of course, this is a fiction, but he wants to give you the impression that the photographs somehow reveal his thoughts. So this first caption, you can probably read it, Bob. You can.
Shall I learn to be good? Question mark, and then
dot, thinking.
I will sit here and think it over.
Yeah, and this particular image was also signed. So he gave these images to friends and to other people as gifts. So that's why he has signed the image. So that's number one. And then number two says, there do seem to be so many so dot, dot, dot. He's going to say difficulties, but it trails off into thinking. So he's asking himself, should I learn to be good? There do seem to be so many difficulties.
It's so clear that he's thinking of representing thought rather than
speech, right?
or writing.
Yeah, because you see the dots are
That's what the dots mean,
yeah.
absolutely.
And yet, if I should really try, and the whole time he's smoking his cigar, which is also an indication that he's thinking. Right, he's got a cigar in his mouth. And then he leans forward a little bit, and he says,
and just put my whole heart in it.
yeah, so he's putting his whole heart in it, trying to be good. And then he's sort of reconsidering. But then I couldn't break the and he does break Sabbath. He breaks the word Sabbath. So then I couldn't break the Sabbath. So if he was trying to be good, he couldn't break the Sabbath. Now you'll notice that a little cat has made its way into the photograph on the bottom there. There were always cats in the Clemens household. He said a house could not be a home without a cat.
How could it prove title?
Yeah. Yeah, so then I couldn't break the Sabbath. That's number 5. And then number 6 is.
And there's so many other privileges that perhaps.
Yeah. So he's thinking about all the privileges he would have to give up if he were good, if he were going to be good. And he's looking off into the distance as if he were thinking very deeply about this question, right? And then he leans back in his chair and he says,
Oh, never mind.
I reckon
I'm good enough just as I am.
So this was a little moral lesson that he wanted to place in his autobiography. But I think that it's really clear that he understands the joke. At the time, silent movies had already entered into American culture. Silent movies entered into American culture toward the end of the 1800s. And I think he was also filmed.
He had been
walking.
filmed, yes. Yeah. No, Edison filming, yes.
Yeah, and this little series of photographs are almost like a silent movie where the intertitles have been placed there to give you the message about what's going on. So he's very savvy about self-representation. You also see him, his dress, right? Yeah.
This is the white suit.
The white suit. Like, can you say something about the white suit? Because I think
Well,
people are probably familiar with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm too familiar with it. Well, basically, I mean, he would wear white in the summer normally like anybody else, but he decides in 1906 that he's going to wear it during the winter as well. So that this is a violation of dress code.
Etiquette of the period.
Right. And it just draws attention to him in a way that almost nothing else did.
Yeah, the white hair.
Yeah, the white hair, the white suit.
Yeah.
And he first broaches this when he's addressing Congress, a committee of Congress in 1906, about copyright, which is a big thing for him, trying to get the copyright laws somewhere nearer to where he'd like them to be. And Howells, saw this and was just stunned by the way it just galvanized everybody around him. And from this on, in public, it's a white suit.
It's a way of being conspicuous again. He even had like a little cape.
Well, yes, I mean, he says, I intend to dress the way the ladies do at the opera, with color, things that, he didn't want to. He didn't like this old black stuff.
Being drab.
I've gotten too old for that.
Yeah. So this was his self-representation. He even had his name trademarked and his image trademarked. Understanding that there was money to be made from having a recognizable image and a recognizable name.
That's partly a reaction to the limitations of copyright law. I mean, the copyright law, when he's in 1906, is really, I think the term is less than 40 years. And they're trying to jack it up, but they don't succeed. And his position is, well, if you take away my copyright, you're basically giving the money-making books to the publisher.
Yeah.
Why would you do that?
Right.
He has trouble recognizing that the purpose of the copyright laws is to have a limited time when it's only yours.
Yeah, I think he also had trouble with the fact that his books were pirated. So if something was published in the United States, the British would pick it up.
Or the Canadians.
Or the Canadians, and they would publish their own edition, right? And he would then lose his profit. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they would easily get into the United States, and they would undercut the price. It was disastrous. Both Prince and the Pauper and Life on the Mississippi wildly undersold his expectations because they were pirated by Canadians, and the laws are simply not good enough to. I mean, a piracy coming in from Canada could be stopped, but they couldn't destroy it, and they couldn't prevent the others from coming in. And they basically gave the author the chance to kind of, buy it. And he said, that's really, if you were doing this with specie, with
money,
$10,000 bills, you wouldn't say that, but that's what you're doing with me.
Yeah.
So he feels very put upon by the copyright situation. And of course, it's not until 1891 that we get an international copyright law, which he's been working at, trying to get done for some time.
Yeah, he's and he was also that way about images of him.
Yes.
That he felt that other people should not be allowed to sell his image, and he really wanted to have. Oh, we have to bring the conversation to a close. Do we have until 12? No, we don't have until 12. What is our time limit, Susan? Because I thought we had till 12.
Hi, okay. Let's do this. Usually these events are only an hour long.
Oh,
And
okay.
so that is, but please, take a few minutes to finish, and then as you and I have talked about, maybe there is part 2 to this discussion. All right.
Images, yeah. So, so if there are, did you want to try, would you like to have us try to take some questions? Is that what you're thinking?
I think please continue.
Okay.
If there's a way of a more natural close than me coming in and interrupting you, my apologies. But we will send the chat questions to both of you and seek an answer before we send out to everybody who's been involved today with the final. Okay.
Okay, so what we had planned originally was to go into we knew that this would happen, that that we can just talk about, and but what we had thought about talking about was the image making. If we're going to do a part 2, we could save this too, but how Samuel Clemens, first of all, most of the listeners probably know that Samuel Clemens made himself into Mark Twain, creates this identity, Mark Twain. And what's kind of interesting, and he also does this with his physical image, through photography, through illustrations and drawings and so on. Yeah, here we go, video footage. Yeah, and so Sam Clemens appears on the left-hand side.
You can't quite see the red. It says it's his autograph. So that's probably his signature.
Is it? Boy, it doesn't look like his handwriting, does it?
Well, but it's very early, so
and also it might have been awkward.
Yeah, we don't have a lot to compare it with.
This
is probably not his signature.
No, that's not his writing. I mean, after a while, you become very familiar. He has very distinctive handwriting, and so it's like, oh, that doesn't look like his handwriting at all. But Sam Clemens becomes Mark Twain, and the metamorphosis, you can also see in some of the imagery. But that first image on the far left-hand side, these are all carte de visite, right?
Right.
So
this is quite early. He's out in Nevada when he's newspaper man.
Yep.
This is 1867 when he's really on the Quaker City trip. This is 1868 when he's out in San Francisco writing Innocents Abroad. And this is really the same period as this one. You can see the sideburns are roughly the
The
same.
mutton chops, yeah,
Mutton chops.
yeah. So there's a kind of a metamorphosis that occurs, and I think if we're going to do a part 2, we might save this. But basically, did you want to try to get to the crossouts, or should we save that for a later
I'll
date?
save it for later. I
We
think
can save it for a later date. So I think one of our main points in thinking about this was that this was an author who both revealed a great deal about himself and also hid or performed a great deal. And so trying to get down to the authentic, the real, the genuine is sometimes something that he blocks you
it's a
from
long
doing.
haul.
Something that he would prefer to block you from doing. If we are going to do this again, I think what we will do is return to these images and probably also show you a little bit about what he does in his writing to both reveal and hide himself. And so I think that this will be enough for today. Did you have anything you wanted to end
No,
with?
I think if we're going to do another one, that's fine.
So it will be continued, the conversation will be continued, and hopefully we'll have a chance to look over your questions.
Yeah.
And if any questions come up, I mean, obviously they could be answered in writing, but if questions come up that we think we would like to actually to discuss, we can put them into our subsequent conversation. It's great to see so many people interested in Mark Twain and hanging on past the hour, and even in some cases for a part 2. So thank you for your attention today.
And thank you. What a wonderful, wonderful conversation. We look forward to part 2. And so I will be in touch with both of you. But what a wonderful way to begin the weekend.
Yes, have a great weekend, everybody. And the
Bye-bye.
sun came out, so you should enjoy yourselves. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye now.